Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola, and I'm here today with Dr. Shiv Chopra, who is coming to us from Canada. Dr. Chopra was with us last year when we were discussing the swine flu vaccine. He was definitely an expert because he has some really interesting training. His formal training is as a veterinarian in India, and he actually came to Canada in 1960, literally 50 years ago. And shortly after Canada, he was moved to England. He worked for a drug company there, where he's head of biological research. And then he went back to Canada, and he worked for 35 years with the Canadian government in what is now called Health Canada. And Health Canada, for those of you not familiar with it, is the equivalent of the FDA in the United States. And his first 25 years there, he worked for the drug approval system for human vaccines. And then he was moved over to human safety evaluation for drugs which are given to food producing animals. And it's his experience in that division of Health Canada that we're going to be talking with him today. We're going to focus on some very important food safety issues because it's the number one issue across the world. American Canadian foods are some of the most toxic foods on the planet, and this is due to the continued use of hormones, antibiotics, rendered slaughter waste, GMOs, pesticides, many of these things we've talked about before, and these foreign introductions can cause disease and death. And we've discussed this previously in the past, and it's a significant issue. And these are some of the primary reasons why you want to choose organic foods. Now, unlike the United States, the European Union countries, most of them do not permit these materials in food production, as they rightfully should, because their primary purpose is to protect the public health. So the issue has been lingering with the WTO for nearly 2 decades, and other food-producing countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico are also getting into the fray. So some of these countries are actually refusing to import Canadian and American beef and GMO crops. So it's a little bit unclear to me, Dr. Chopra. Welcome, first of all. But for the items I just discussed with respect to introducing all these relatively toxic elements into our food supply, that is clearly true for America. Is it also true for the Canadian system?
Thank you very much. One small correction. I worked for about 18 years in vaccines and antibiotics for humans, and then the other half of the 35 years, I worked for the human safety evaluation of drugs which are given to food-producing animals. It was in the Bureau of Veterinary Drugs of Health Canada. This is where, as soon as I got in there, the first product that landed on my desk was recombinant bovine growth hormone in 1988. And I was concerned. I raised some questions because it was a growth hormone and was given to cows and totally unnecessarily, only to produce, with the claim to increase milk production in cows, so they'll become cheaper and make more profit for farmers and so forth. Produced by Monsanto and a competing company, Eli Lilly, and both of them came to Canada and they wanted approval for it. And the questions I raised were very simple. There's normal scientific questions. If you're going to give something to food-producing animals, then under the laws of both the countries, the company must demonstrate that it will produce no harm ultimately to people who consume that product. And they said, no, they don't want to test it, and there's no need to test it because it's the same hormone, although it's genetically engineered, same hormone that the cow produces. I said, it doesn't matter. Even if it's naturally produced hormone obtained from the cows, if you give excess of it, just like if you take too much insulin for yourself, you can die. If you take too much thyroxine, you can die. And so things like that. So I said, you must test it in laboratory animals as required under the law. And they did not want to test it. They did not test it. And the US FDA passed it anyway. And so the pressure went on and on and on until I blew the whistle in 1997. In the sense, I didn't blow the whistle. I just simply said, we need to test it. And the pressure the pressure from my bosses all the way going up to the top and out into the political circles of the government bureaucracy under the prime minister. They were saying, just pass it because the US has passed it. So I wouldn't pass it. So some of my colleagues and I took the matter up in court. We filed grievances, and the matter became public. And I had written a report on it. It was called the gaps analysis, and it was actually ordered by the department that I should write that report, and they formed a committee of 4 scientists, and we produced that report, gaps analysis report, and we showed that the certain data that I had asked for back in 1988 had actually been produced by Monsanto. It was sitting under our noses, locked up. Nobody would let us see it. And it was also received by, at the US FDA. And all the questions that I had asked were then came out to be positive, exactly my concerns.
Let me
In
just
other words,
interject.
it increased.
Can I just interject something here just for clarification? So it was 1988, and that was Monsanto that you were challenged with, and they were the producer of the bovine growth hormone at that time. Is that correct?
They produced the bovine growth hormone, and also another competing company, Eli Lilly. Their subsidiary was called Elanco. They also had it. Now the U.S.
Well, I
has a
just wanted a
law
point of
for.
clarification because I think just to get the time frame historical perspective correct, this is the same Monsanto that is responsible for producing nearly all of the GMO crops in the world. But in 1988 hadn't yet produced any because I believe they weren't introduced until the mid 90s. Is that correct?
Yes, while Eli Lilly had produced human insulin back in the early 80s, that's when the competition for GMOs began, because that was a human product. So
Yeah.
that was, and they had monopoly. Eli Lilly had a monopoly. And when the idea came up that they wanted to produce this bovine growth hormone the same way from E. coli bacteria by genetic modification of the bacteria, and Monsanto got the US government to agree that in the United States, patent will be given only to one company per product, and that was it. And Monsanto got that patent for RBGH, the recombinant bovine growth hormone, and Eli Lilly felt shortchanged. So the case was filed in U.S. federal court, and Monsanto won. And well, actually, they made an out-of-court settlement that in the U.S. only Monsanto will sell the RBGH, but elsewhere in the country they will share the markets. And it was for that reason that Eli Lilly, Elanco, came to Canada. They wanted to test it, and the product that I looked at belonged to Eli Lilly. But it didn't matter. The same questions applied to both. And I asked those tests to be done in rats. And at that time, I assumed they had not been done. And then now from 88, we are in 1997. I insisted that those tests be provided. I had written a letter to Elanco. I said, what happened to my letter? You're pressuring me to pass it, just sign off. And I want to know what happened to my letter. And that's how I forced the department to let me look at all the data. And a committee was set up, and we went into the files, and then we discovered, lo and behold, the results had been gathered by Monsanto, and all my fears turned out to be positive. In other words, exactly the questions I had raised, the data that needed to be gathered had been gathered by Monsanto, and the report was sitting under our noses, and it showed that it increased insulin-like growth factor in rats. It increased thyroid activity. It produced effect in the testes. And I had also asked them to do a test in female rats, which they didn't, because I was concerned about the ovary and the progesterone and so on. And all those